Welcome to the How I Became podcast, all about entrepreneurship.
Jaclyn, welcome to the How I Became podcast. I'm so excited to have you, the co-founder of Benepass, on the podcast and telling a little bit about you and your story and how you've grown the company to where it is today.
Thanks for having me here, Kelly. Yeah, so my name is Jaclyn, and I'm one of the co-founders and CEO here at Benepass. We started the company about 4 years ago, and our goal is to help companies give their employees a personalized and flexible benefits experience. And I think a lot of that came from, having worked in big corporate types of companies and industries. So my co-founders, like I came from finance before, my co-founders formerly in tech. I think we worked in industries where, the companies were saying like, we have a really, high compensation and benefits package. But the analogy I always make is like for a lot of employees, benefits are on this imaginary shelf where you don't know what's on the shelf, and taking things off the shelf is really administratively burdensome that a lot of people just kind of give up on it. And I think it results in a lot of like underutilization of benefits. And for, I think, companies, this is a pretty significant portion of spend. And so it results in, a lot of corporate waste if they're buying benefits and employees aren't aware of them, they're not using them. Typical stats in the US are around like 30% of your total compensation package is in the value of benefits. But I think if you ask your average employee, they have no idea that that's what their company spends. And our whole, mission and what we're building at Benepass is to kind of bridge that gap and to make benefits really accessible, personalizable, and delightful at the end of the day.
I use Benepass, as you know, and I absolutely love it. It's probably one of my most used apps in my phone because I'm constantly checking and seeing, okay, like what else can I do? How else can I, enjoy my life a little bit more? So personally, I love it. So I think that gap is definitely being bridged. How did you identify that as a problem from the get-go? Because it's a meaty problem, not one that I think would be, the sexiest to get into. So what kind of got you into that world?
Yeah. I think as with most founders, there's a little bit of a lived experience, and then there's kind of and for someone like me, there's a little bit of like an academic approach, like thinking about problem spaces and markets kind of on top of that. So the first half is, just like I said, having been an employee within an industry where ostensibly it's like very compensation and benefits rich, I always felt like the company was telling me like, these are the things that we care about, and therefore these are the things that we're providing. And, there's also, like, I remember when I, showed up to work, like, first as a 22-year-old fresh out of college, companies were telling us about all these great, like, for example, parental benefits, which are amazing for companies to provide. But as a 22-year-old, that wasn't applicable to me at that current life stage. And I think as your, life stage evolves, what matters to you kind of evolves. And it's really tough for companies to like fully predict that and be there at every step of the way as your kind of personal circumstances change. So I definitely had that experience where I felt like, some of the more important things to me weren't necessarily being addressed by what the company was offering. And so that's kind of the, I guess, lived experience portion. The other more, just as like, I wanted to become a founder. I think I had the ambition and, certainly I had this lived experience, but I think it's quite another thing to say like, okay, I'm going to actually try to start something and, bring about the change and build this new thing because, I'm a first time founder. I have not worked in human resources or like in a people function. A lot of my role has been, getting our early customers in a sales capacity, and that also wasn't my background. And so there's a little bit of gumption and naivete that, it takes to kind of like make that jump. And so what, kind of propelled me to do that was thinking about, the market, the sheer size of the market, reading that stat in terms of how much companies spend here and seeing the market opportunity. Also with my background in financial services and seeing some of the new like fintech that was available to help startups like us get, started quicker. Some of the like banking as a software service types of companies that, we use today as program partners to get started, kind of the fintech stack underneath the hood. So definitely a confluence of things. I mean, startups are it's never that perfect story that founders tell of like, oh, this led to this, led to this, but kind of confluence of all those things made me excited about the opportunity and to build something here.
So you mentioned that you wanted to be a founder and that was a bit of an ambition for you. What led you, down being an entrepreneur? Kind of how did this ambitious line before you help guide you to where you are today and wanting to be an entrepreneur?
I am really just excited by building a place where I would want to work and creating that environment for the people around me. I don't know where it officially started, but yeah, I mean, I think I always grew up thinking and seeing examples of work being a really meaningful portion of who you are as an individual and a lot of time spent, right? I mean, we spend at least 40 hours a week at work, and that's often more time than I have for spending with like friends and family. And so I think it gives like my work and contribution to the world gives me meaning. It gives me purpose. It gives me challenge. It's the I guess the vehicle for challenges and overcoming obstacles. And I just think that that's such an important part of who we are and how we spend our time. And so it just really matters to me that Benepass, for the idea and what we're doing for our customers, but also how we're building the company for the people that work here. And I spent the early part of my career working on Wall Street where you're working 60, 80, 100-hour weeks and just spending so much time at work. And I think that that was an incredible experience in terms of just the sheer amount of time I spent at work and therefore the amount that I learned and being around being around people who are really excellent and dedicated to their work. But I always thought that, hey, there are some things that I would love to bring into the work culture, if I had my way. And, starting a company is a way to get your way really fast. You're CEO of one is how you kind of ascend to the top immediately. But a lot of, what I take pride and joy around building Benepass is, both for our customers and for our employees.
It's an amazing journey, especially, not having that HR background, but just taking the time to learn about what that gap is and then diving into it. Was there a point growing up, or maybe it was just once you entered the workforce and figuring out how do I want to get to the top, or solve a big problem? When you thought about being an entrepreneur, what did that look like to you? And has it evolved once you actually, started a business from when it was an aspiration of yours?
Yeah. I think in the last, I don't know, 10, 15 years, like startups and tech and Silicon Valley has become a big part of kind of just more like higher, cultural awareness. And so I think there's like a glamorization of like what being a founder is. And there's kind of this like, what is a founder versus an entrepreneur? And I think founders just like rebranding of what being an entrepreneur is. And for me, I think I wanted to go down this at this point in my career because I thought it would be the place where I could learn the most in the most intense way. And that's definitely turned out to be the case. I think, yeah, I mean, I had the ambition one day to, take a company public and have and build a really big and successful business. But really, the 0 to 0.1 is exceptionally hard and is really just about putting one foot in front of the other and thinking, what are my goals for the next 2 weeks? Like you can't think about necessarily, you don't deserve to think about goals for the next like 10 years if you've only been around for, less than 6 months.
Right.
And so a lot of, I think the early entrepreneurship journey is really not sexy and it's really just, and when you don't have momentum, it's really hard to like create momentum from the ground up. I mean, I remember my earliest days, I would just like open up my laptop and just say, well, what am I going to do today? Because, I had the skeleton of an idea. I didn't have co-founders at the time. I just was trying to talk to people about an idea. And, it's hard to talk to people about an idea because, everyone's kind of wants to be nice to you and says like, oh, that sounds nice. And then you just try to figure out like how to interview people and understand their problems and then brainstorm solutions. And all that is, like I said, in the early days, very not glamorous. And I think a lot of what entrepreneurship is just like grit and just keeping after it and, and having a strong conviction that this vision that you have should and will become, some sort of reality one day. And then I think a little bit of naivete to not think about all the different obstacles that will inevitably come up in the middle.
It's funny when you mentioned about everyone wants to be nice and everyone's very supportive of your idea. I find sometimes there's a sentiment of people saying everyone's going to be against you. Everyone's going to say that you're going to fail. But I think the reality is no one cares enough to be that negative. I think everyone's just like, great idea, go for it, eye roll. And it's the people who actually take the time to say, here's why I think you might be successful, or here's where I don't, maybe dig into this area is actually a lot more valuable than people who are just, so to the idea either way. But to your point, as the founder yourself, you just have to have the grit and push through and find the people who are going to support you along the journey, which I know at the beginning you were a solo entrepreneur and you don't have a technical background coming from the financial side. So what was that journey building tech product, but not as a technical founder? And what was the journey to bringing on some more technical folks? Or how did you think about that from the beginning? Because that from day one, you're facing a big hurdle.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so I graduated from business school in 2019. I graduated from Stanford, and I was in my second year focused on trying to find co-founders to kind of be a part of the journey with me. And it's funny, at that time, I was planning to move to New York. That was, where my then boyfriend, fiance, now husband lived. And so that's where I planned to live after graduating from Stanford. But the bulk of my classmates were thinking about staying in the Bay Area. And so I just didn't meet like a co-founder when I was in business school. And so when I graduated, I remember thinking, well, I'm getting married in October. It's currently June. And so, let me just, between now and October, I will just work on my idea and finish like wedding planning and get married and do the honeymoon and all that. And if after that, this isn't going anywhere, then I will apply for a job and get a real job. And so when I talk about I'm just optimizing for the next like couple of months at a time. So that's what I did. And I remember shortly thereafter the wedding in October, I applied to Y Combinator, the startup accelerator, kind of on a whim. And at the time, it felt somewhat remote because I know YC, has predominantly in the past had technical founders. So me being not technical was, maybe a strike, if you will. And the thought of going back and boomeranging back to the Bay Area for 3 months, it's funny now with the pandemic, everyone is like, so, we're remote first. It has completely become a non-issue. But at the time, it seemed like that was going to be a barrier. And so I remember literally the night I applied to YC was because my husband said, hey, I'm going to be late coming home from work. So our dinner plans got canceled. I was like, well, I have nothing better to do. I might as well just type my application. And so I just did the application of like one fell swoop. And I was like, let me just hit submit and see what happens. And, fortunately, or whatever it was, I was selected to interview, and ultimately I did get in. And I was solo at the time. And I remember them calling me and with the acceptance and saying, you're building a software company, yet you can't write software. And so we suggest you try to find some co-founders who can do that pretty critical skill. I took that advice. And so for the next 3 months, I said, okay, I'm going to try to find co-founders who can bring the skills to the table that I certainly don't have in building this software company. And meeting my co-founders was also somewhat serendipitous. I have 2 co-founders who we've been together for the last 4 years. And so, my journey as solo really lasted a grand total of just a couple of months. I mean, I really think of our company as the 3 of us working together. Right. So Mark and Kabir. Mark was actually one of my housemates when I was in my second year of business school. At Stanford, you live in these passed down houses that are 5 or 6 roommates. And he was our one non-business school housemate. So while we went to class, he went to work, and then we all, hung out and had parties on the weekends. And so he had just left his job at Google and was figuring out what was next. And I think he also had a startup itch and wanted to do something there. And then Kabir, I was actually introduced to by a business school classmate who ultimately, Mo Islam, who is an investor at Threshold, and they ultimately led our Series A round. I remember sitting next to Mo at a brunch, and we were just like, hey, what have you been doing since business school? And I said, oh, well, I had this idea. I got into YC and I need to find a technical co-founder. And Mo said, oh, let me introduce you to Kabir. Kabir is one of the smartest people I've ever met. And, maybe you'll have something. And it was funny. So the three of us, like, we met. I mean, Kabir was already in New York. Mark was in the Bay Area. We kind of sat in a room for like one weekend, like 3 days in a row, just like talking about the idea, figuring out like, do we want to work together? And, it just happened to work out great. And so, and at the time nothing was perfect, shall we say. Like, the perfect co-founding story is like, you've worked together before, you have a long history. And so the ups and downs and problems that you face, you already have some sense of overcoming that. And
Right.
Mark, Kabir, and I had none of that. But I think, where we over-index is we're all, really just want the best for the company, want to build something. I think everyone's really self-aware around strengths and weaknesses, what we bring to the table versus not. And then three of us just decided, hey, let's do YC together and see what happens. And I've always been of the mindset that, if it isn't working, we can fix it. And so to me, I was like, okay, I have two co-founders. If one of them works out, great. If both of them work out, great. If none of them work out, I still have this great experience through the startup accelerator that is going to be worthwhile in and of itself. And so that was my attitude going into YC. And that's kind of, I guess, how it all cobbled together. And we joined YC in January of 2020, and that was right before the pandemic. And then a lot has happened since then, but that's really when the company actually, I think, really got started. We started building, tried to acquire customers. But yeah, it was cobbled together in the early days.
It's always exciting to hear the co-founder story, whether it was very strategic and you're, interviewing a bunch of people, or, I mean, in this case, it seems like it just I know there's a lot of work that goes in, but it just like kind of magically came together to then build such a successful company for your first time all working together is very unique. How did you feel emotionally in letting go some of the company? Because I imagine in your head, you kind of paint this picture of making all the decisions and being the CEO and growing the company, and then bringing in not just one, but two co-founders, and you have to trust that they're going to love this baby that you're building as much as you do. So I know there's challenges, but how did you feel about it?
Yeah. I think the way I think about it for my first time, and I took a little bit of like the YC advice, frankly, in this, is that I really care about this business becoming something. I would rather have some portion of something than 100% of nothing.
Zero.
And so I've never optimized for claiming it in that way. Mark, Kabir, and I have been equal co-founders from the beginning. It was my idea to start, but that's just a fact. It's not indicative in our ownership stakes by any means. Yeah. And I've always wanted to take away factors or obstacles that could get in the way. And I do think that having unequal equity stakes in the beginning for co-founders is one of those things that just is always in the back of your head in terms of making decisions and, overcoming issues where you don't all agree. And so that taking that off the table of like, oh, it's, my way or their way or whatever. And, those sort of I guess dynamics in the background that are always going to be there. I've always been focused, what's like the best decision going forward. And I think that, we were clear about our roles in that, I'm CEO, there's business decisions. Ultimately, if it's like a 51-49, I make the decision. But I think having that, like I said, that little seed in the back of your head around unequal equity stakes was just, I think I wanted to just remove that from the conversation. And I think that also gave a lot of faith to Mark and Beer in the early days. I really did view them as full-time co-founders. And I mean, look, all things, I am also a firm believer, if it doesn't work, you can fix it. You can have an adult conversation about it not working. You can redo equity stakes if that's really what it, needs to come down to. And I think the ability for us to kind of continue to be real with each other, have a really like honest, transparent, and like well-intended relationship has, I think, been a really big plus for the company in terms of like the stability of the co-founding team.
It's a great message. I think it also shows a lot of your leadership in going into, that weekend and figuring out what the company will look like from the get-go. It's a really great mindset. How has your leadership style evolved over the last 4 years of growing the company? If it has, I imagine it has, because now you're leading quite a big team. But how do you continue to work on that? Because you clearly had really great leadership qualities from the beginning, but what has that looked like as an evolution over the last little while?
It's definitely an evolution as a founder because I think my job changes quite dramatically every 6 months or so. And I forget who there's this like it might be, I keep on referencing Y Combinator, but I think it's like Ali Rogani who wrote this article about how like the founder journey, like in the beginning, it's just grit and you got to do things. It's kind of like an icy figure it out, figure it out however you can, grit mentality. And then you start building a team, and then the role becomes about managing and not like, can you push a boulder up the hill, but can you get other people to help you push a boulder up the hill? And then later it becomes much more about like what we think about quintessential like leadership, if you will, like, leading a bigger team, setting the vision and all that. And like your job really changes as your company becomes more successful. And so I think in the beginning, I mean, there wasn't a lot to quote unquote lead. It was like the three of us, we had different, roles and responsibilities. And just like literally the goals were, can we acquire one customer? Can we acquire 10 customers? Can we get our initial round of funding? Those are sort of the most basic level goals. And now my job is about, figuring out, what is the right team to kind of execute on the vision? Where are we going in the next couple of years? Raising money. And then a lot of it, I think, is around communication and clarity of communication. I'm thinking about my leadership style in that vein. But, some of the values that we have at the company are, we say our three core values are empathy, seeking joy, and setting audacious goals. And I think that is my style in a nutshell. And I've kind of, I think imparted that on the company. And for me, the empathy piece is understanding where other people are coming from. And I think that is how we found the pain point, is like interviewing customers when we've never been in that role. And I think also that, has you can see that in many, many different ways at the company. I think it's really just a kind, generous group of people. Seeking joy is around, it's we treat our goals intensely, but we're a laid back group, and people are funny and want to be themselves, and like there's fun in work, and also when we meet big overcome big obstacles together, there's like a joy in celebrating that. We definitely try to impart on the culture. And then the last one is about audacious goals, ambition. And I think that's a big part of who I am. And I want to build a really big business. And I have a big vision for what we can all do together. And I want people individually to also think audaciously about what they can do at the company. As our company grows, their roles and scopes can expand quite dramatically, more so than like a larger, more stable kind of corporate type of environment. And so, yeah, I mean, it's definitely evolved, and I think it will continue to evolve. And I'm still figuring out what my leadership style is, quote unquote. But I think, the best thing I try to do in the interim is be authentic, be transparent, and, be, and set a good example of what, high quality, excellent, being a high quality, excellent coworker is myself.
It's such a challenging job, to your point. Like every 6 months, it's changing so much. On a previous episode, one of the founders mentioned, he goes, every 6 months, I pretty much fire myself and then rehire the new me, because you're changing and you have to evolve, not just like literally how you're leading a team, but the company is hopefully growing and changing every 6 months as well. So you have to adapt to that, which I thought was really interesting. And you echo that as well. So I'm sure it's exciting. It's also hard work, because not only are you growing a business, but you're like consciously having to evolve yourself as well.
Yeah. Just on that point, I think the most important skill skill around being a founder is selling. And I don't think I knew that going in, and I've since figured that out because, in the beginning, it's selling your first customer, selling yourself because your product is an MVP, right? It's minimally viable, so it's not, a fulsome product. So you have to sell yourself, sell the vision to a paying customer. Then eventually you have to sell investors on what, the 10-year billion-dollar outcome is going to be, especially for if you're trying to raise venture capital type of funding. And then you're also selling employees, your existing ones, prospective new hires, because you have to build a team. And so much of like marketing yourself and being confident, but being authentic in that's been a real journey for me. That's a skill that I don't think is taught often in business schools. And, as a finance person, I was like, oh, just like, here I am in my Excel spreadsheet and have comfort in doing that and building slides. But I think being authentic and being good at that and understanding the other person and how you connect with them, that's been a big learning curve for me. And that's the one thing I wish I knew that would be like such an important skill of being a founder. That I definitely did not realize the importance of which beforehand.
And you mentioned about, selling to the VCs as well. So I'm curious about that part of the journey as well. And it's an evolution. I think it's something that is ongoing. But how did you and your co-founders decide that VC was the right route for you? And what did that, from if you did a family and friends round to I know you did, I think it was about 2 years ago, your Series A. What did that evolution look like, and how did you decide that that was the right way of raising?
Yeah. Venture capital, I mean, it's gone through several cycles, even in the 4 short years we've been doing this. Like I said, we graduated from YC at right when the pandemic was hitting in like March and April of 2020. Then there was, the craziness of 2021, and then the dip recently. And so it's been a boom. I feel like it's been a boom bust cycle in just like my 4 short years. Look, venture capital is about big risk and big reward. And raising venture funding means that you're going to have the pockets to go take a big swing and to really, invest and try out something new and really you're swinging for the fences, if you will, a very fast billion-dollar outcome. There are downsides to that, and that you can swing and miss and it is a quick boom bust. And I think, the last 18 months have taught founders more about discipline, about margins, about efficiency. And certainly that's been something that, I think for us, the pivot there as a company has not been as dramatic, but certainly, we've had to kind of, figure out how to be more efficient in kind of the last 18 months. But like I said, venture is about, it's got to be a big target market. It's got to be a big swing, and you really have to have the ambition to build something large. And frankly, for someone like me personally, I think I'm a little bit more conservative in what my vision is. Sometimes I'm like, oh, here's what I think could happen. But I'm very much thinking, well, what are the next 10 obstacles I'm going to face, and how am I going to overcome them? And you kind of have to have this brazen, irrational confidence in your ability to figure it out, because, those billion-dollar outcomes are rare and not everyone gets there. But you kind of have to have like that self-belief, the grit, the kind of just, like I said, it's probably irrational, it's probably brazen, and you just got to keep pursuing it. And I think that's, raising venture funding is like, there's pros and cons to it. There's high expectations of growth, given the, amount of money that you can raise at an early stage where with a valuation that you probably don't deserve. But it's about taking kind of big swings.
I think a lot of the themes that I'm hearing from entrepreneurs is you have to be a little bit delusional in the dream and just lean into it, because
100%.
if you are and you end up not being delusional, then it all worked out. And if you are, then better luck next time. But you just have to be like, I might be crazy here, but it's worth the risk.
That's right.
And then to your point, selling that delusion to the VCs and showing them why they should buy into the journey with you.
Yeah. That muscle of pitching is definitely something that I've had to learn because I think, like I said, it doesn't come naturally. Just overall selling doesn't come naturally to me personally.
Right.
I was the type of person in college who like studying for a test. I read the syllabus and like just be like, okay, I'm going to study. And then I had some friends who were like, ask upperclassmen, like, hey, how did that test go? And so I think part of figuring it out as a founder is like figuring out some of those like unfair side advantages. And, for me personally, I've always been like, here's my calculation, here's the merit of the idea, and like really focus on that. But it is about storytelling and painting a big picture. And that is such an important skill. And you kind of have to figure out your own authentic way to do that. And for me, there's, like I'm a numbers driven, like analysis driven type of person, and that's what is compelling to me is arguments that have those like levels of analysis behind them. But like you said, with venture, sometimes you can't analyze your way there. You just have to have some sort of like brazen confidence and belief and just conviction. And I think that is ultimately, especially in the early days of raising venture, that is what gets you the investment, not necessarily like the math behind it.
Yeah, especially because for Series A or whatnot, you're still pretty early days, so you might not have, the full picture. So you have to paint that picture and show them how you're going to get there.
Yeah.
How did you? It's not just VC choosing you; it's also you choosing who you're going to partner with and grow this company with. So how did you assess the right partners for you and the co-founders to make sure that you're getting the right type of support if you want VCs that are a little bit more handholdy versus here's money and do it yourself and we'll see what happens. Like how did you make that assessment when you were looking?
Yeah. I mean, the real answer is I don't know that we were necessarily like the most, I guess, like rigorous or systematic in thinking about this. I will say
Yeah.
we've gotten very fortunate to work with investors who've been quite founder friendly and I think have struck a good balance of, support, but also like hands off and like letting us run the business. Our very first seed investor was after YC. And so we did not take friends and family money. We've taken very little, frankly, friends and family money. It's all been mostly institutional capital behind Benepass. So our very first check that was more institutional, was from Gradient Ventures, who led our seed round. It's Google's early stage venture fund. And in particular, the partners that worked there were former founders themselves. And I really liked that. And I think that was something that was super useful in the early days, just like understanding what it was like to be in the trenches, kind of the detailed random problems that we had that they had faced and, maybe not the identical problem, but some variant of it and could, empathize and also provide like really tactical advice. That worked out great. As opposed, and then our next round with Threshold and Mo, like I said, is a former classmate, knew Kabir really well they used to work together in a previous role. And so I think having that level of like familiarity with each other also really helped have that like kind of core level of trust in terms of what we were building. And so, I think there's different like venture capital firms in terms of like flavors. There's, especially in the early days, you can take friends and family money or like from an angel or like, a single shingle, like an investor that is just themselves as an investor versus some of the more institutionalized seed funds. I think there's pros and cons to both of them. For me, like we had the ability to raise money. We did. And I don't think I was particularly scientific in terms of thinking about the types of investors. And we've gotten, like I said, pretty lucky, I think, in the ones that we have worked with. But, for me, I was like, we need to raise money. We did it. And we just did it and moved on. We
Yeah.
didn't, spend a ton of time like thinking about like, oh, these specific pros and cons. But what you're solving for, I think, is you want to make sure they're not going to be, you want to back channel the crap out of those investors. Through LinkedIn, most investors like say exactly who they've worked with. And so you want to call those founders, and founders are incredibly open and generous in terms of giving that, investor back channel. And so that's my, like, I guess number one tip is just, you may not know what style you prefer, but go talk to other founders who will give you like a very real take on,
Yeah.
how valuable or invaluable those investors have been.
It's a great tip, and even bigger than, I mean, just in the VC space of conversation, I think building a network with other founders is incredibly important when you're getting started, but also throughout the journey. Curious if you have relied on a network of founders as you're building this company to kind of, whether it's brainstorm with or just have as a network to vent to. Is that something
Yeah.
that is important to you? Is it?
Yes, it's been a really important part of my journey because I think, and that's also why I have co-founders as a start. We
Right.
joke that like founding being a founder is like it's a roller coaster. There's like so many days are like ones and tens, right? Like in terms of like the highs and lows. And we just joke that as long as we're not having ones all the same day, then that's how we kind of continue to progress. But I think joining the startup accelerator, Y Combinator in the early days is the definition of trying to find that community. That was really great, and especially in the small groups that we had, there were 4 or 5 other companies that we would meet with weekly to say, here's an update on our progress, here's what we built, here's some challenges, here's some wins, and that was really awesome to have that community of people who are going through similar types of things. I think that's the value of a startup accelerators. You have other companies that are going through the exact same thing at the same time. Because like I said, there's no momentum, it's hard to create momentum. And so being in a community with other people really is useful for that. And then during the pandemic, actually, I'm in a kind of called like a CEO support group with other founders from my business school class. And we've kept that going for, I think, going on 3 years now. But we meet every 6 weeks roughly. There's like 6 of us in that group, and everyone's business is really different. But we just share, highs and lows and what we call, ones and tens in terms of problems, like your most intense issue that you can't, maybe be as open with your investors, maybe even your co-founders, certainly not employees or customers, but these are like your most, your top problems. And we just kind of help each other talk through them and troubleshoot. And that's been a really great, I think, source of comfort and inspiration over the years. And I really have appreciated that.
That's very cool. Do you find that there's themes in, what is bubbling up as a 1 versus a 10? And
Yeah, there are definitely themes that come up from talking to folks. I think it's funny, a lot of our top 10 or our top like 3 couple of issues are really around people and just co-founders, people that we hire. A lot of it has been around like people issues. And I think that's a common thing when you start to scale. When you're just 3 co-founders or, even up to like 10 people, everyone fits in one Zoom room and you can kind of continue to just, keep trudging forward and you're kind of magically on the same page. But I think the most common issues have been around people, direct reports, co-founders, and kind of like troubleshooting those types of relationships. I don't think I'm like really quite good at networking. I've heard these tips and I don't action them, but I'll spew out the tips that I've heard, which is, it's great to have a mentor who is a founder who might be a year or 2 ahead of you because they recently had your problem and can help give you some of that perspective. I don't have that. Like I've heard that sounds great, but that's what I've heard is also can be useful. But yeah, I will say the commonalities, even though our businesses aren't the same, there's B2B, there's B2C, there's stage, there's growth, kind of people types of issues, whether, like I said, that's dealing with co-founders, investors, direct reports, that's been probably the most common thread in our discussions.
it makes sense because it's the biggest mover of the business is the people, right? Like you're not going to have the
Yeah.
business without those. And when you're starting your business, you're so focused on, you plus if 1 or 2 founders, if you have co-founders, if you have that, and the problem you're solving. And it's an added problem having to manage all these people on top of growing, to solve that problem. So I think that as a theme makes sense.
Few last questions that I like to ask. And we've talked about a few of them, I think, throughout this podcast anyways, but curious if there's any myths that you were told when you were first getting started on your entrepreneurial journey that turns out to not be true, or that you want to, dispel for future founders.
I think one of the myths about starting a company is the glamour of it, or what I would say is the lack of glamour around it. I think starting Benepass has been the highest highs and the lowest lows. And in a way that makes what I thought were previous highs and lows, like more like threes and sevens as opposed to like ones and nines. And I think and maybe part of this was being at Stanford, being in Silicon Valley. I had this like glamorous vision of like what it meant to, raise venture money, to build a big startup, and this like so many different success stories. And it's really hard day in and day out. I mean, I wouldn't do anything different. You have to kind of embrace the hard and the challenges and like the joy and a sense of like confidence and just feeling great about overcoming some of those challenges. Yeah. But it's just really hard. And you just have to like day in and day out have the grit to keep doing it. And I think, like I said, I wouldn't do anything different. I would not be doing this role, but I think I didn't fully understand or like would know how it would feel on some of those like hard and, ones and tens types of days.
Do you think that having, the co-founders has helped lift you out of those like bottom days?
I think that's why you need co-founders in the beginning. Because, there's no momentum when in the early days. And so you got to figure out how to spark, and it's easier when there's like other people to spark with. Yeah. And then, managing the highs and lows. Between Mark, Beer, and me, we have highs and lows on different days, and that's useful for a little bit of context. And I think when other people, when they're having tens, I'm like, I feel really great about that. And when they're having ones and I'm having, not ones, then it's helpful to like provide a little bit of context, like, hey, it's not going to be that bad. It's going to be okay. That I think has been so great about this journey, is having co-founders, and I think has been instrumental. I don't think I could have done this, or at least certainly not my first time around. I don't think I could have done this without co-founders and having that support.
On that point of it's so intense throughout this, how are you managing outside life?
Yeah, I think a lot of founders talk about burnout and how intense the journey can be. For me, I think having a stable personal life, I have, lots of friends and family that I do prioritize and seeing, I think has helped me set some boundaries around like when and how much I work to feel kind of continuously energized. And so for me, like personally, I work Monday through Thursday. I kind of like work around the clock, and I truly, I'm up early. I start thinking about work immediately. I take a break for dinner, and then I work after dinner, and, I don't have kids. And so right now I just have that type of time. My husband, he frankly works a lot also. And so Monday through Thursday, we're both like really working. But I will say like Friday, around 5:00, I'm starting to check out and be done. And I love to fully shut down my computer, like, close all the tabs, and I fully shut down my computer. And I really don't work on weekends, like not even at all, not even a little. Like occasionally there might be a sprint, but I mean, like that happens less than 5 times a year, I would say. I really love and value my weekends as like a full shutdown mode. And I think for the company, that's been also really good too, is because we're on different time zones during the weekday. There's a lot of like messages that happen on Slack kind of around the clock for folks, just because people are in offset time zones. But on the weekends, we really try to shut down and give people kind of that full, uninterrupted time.
It's such an important message, not just for founders, but even your team, to see that this is how you're prioritizing work, and you also prioritize life, and that it gives them permission to do that as well. I think sometimes you see founders who are sending messages at, 10 p.m. on a Saturday, and you're just like, well, I guess I'm like going to answer really quickly. But to see that you give, yourself the space, gives your team the permission to choose to take that space if they want to as well, which is so important.
Yeah, setting a good example there is important.
Very last question. If you were to name this episode for Jaclyn, How I Became fill in the blank, what would you name your episode?
It's a good question. I was actually thinking about this when I was looking at your other people who have named it. I think in the spirit of like the job changing every 6 months, I was going to say like how I became a confident chameleon. Because I think what I figured out about myself is not that I'm necessarily like the absolute best at one specific type of skill, but I can figure it out. And I think that that's what I have confidence in myself is like, okay, I know my job is going to change 6 months from now or 3 months from now. And I feel good about my ability to make that change and like do a solid job in that before I, fire myself and get someone who's better at it in doing that at the company, or fulfilling that role and function. And so I think about that as like my founder journey is like figuring out how to do new things, and figuring out quickly how to do them well.
That's a fabulous name. I really like that one. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. You have shared such an inspirational story as a female founder and growing a really meaningful business that I know so many people get so much value out of. I'm excited to see how it continues to evolve and grow over the next many, many years. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
How I Became, a BloomX podcast, is hosted by Kelly Yafet and does not constitute a recommendation for any organization, product, or service. For more How I Became content, subscribe where you get your podcasts and visit bloomx.io to join us on Discord.